Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to give this speech, especially to Max, and thank you to Dr. Kitty for a very kind introduction. I'm in a sort of state of panic because it seems I'm a very strange person to invite to give this speech. The conference is about international relations, development, and human rights. It's about looking to the future, and I'm a historian, and I tend to think about the past. It's also very much international, and I tend to concentrate very tightly on Thailand. So I had to think, when doing this, am I going to write about the subjects of this conference that I don't know much about, or should I stick more to what I know? And I've decided in the end I should try and stick to what I know. Also, so it's not very much about the topic that's up, that you're seeing up there. Also, this is a very historic day. This is the first anniversary of one of the most unsettling events in Thailand's modern history. So this is for Payaban Gate and all the others. The results of 3 elections set aside, 1 by military coup and 2 by judicial decision. 3 political parties disbanded and 220 MPs, equivalent to half the legislature, almost banned for 5 years. The constitution rewritten to reduce the power of the elected parliament and executive in favor of the appointed bureaucracy and judiciary. A godfathered mob taking over the government house and then the capital's airport while the army stood by. A demonstration ending with over 90 dead and 1,000 injured, but no accountability at all because the army refuses to cooperate, and not a trace of remorse or apology on the part of the government that ordered the crackdown. 130 people in detention for over a year, and the army chief coming out almost every day to tell us what to think and what to do. 8,000 websites closed down under a new draconian law. Many print publications banned and radio stations closed. Sentences for thought crimes on a par with those for manslaughter. And more new cases of lèse-majesté in the past 5 years than over the previous 50. A rising trend of open harassment of critical academics. The mainstream press practicing self-censorship, and in all the international rankings for press freedom, the country has been downgraded from the upper half of the league table to its lowest rungs. And all this in perspective. A decade ago, Thailand was hailed as the beacon of democracy in Southeast Asia. Its press as one of the most free and boisterous. Its civil society as sophisticated and maturing. The long era of military domination of politics seemed at last consigned to the past. A new constitution, the first compiled with public participation, was heralded as the charter of a truly post-authoritarian order. Activists were excited at the prospect of using the constitution's catalogue of human and civil rights to force reform in many areas, and an election installed a government which seemed to have the strength, vision, and energy to take this reforming momentum to a new level. Leaders talked of accelerating Thailand to OECD status, meaning not only a step up to a higher income level, but a shift towards international standards in law, politics, and social governance. It all seems now a long, long time ago. The contrast over 1 decade is very striking and rather shocking. It's the result of a conservative reaction, a backlash of very considerable force and largely unforeseen. In this talk, I want to give a bird's eye view of what happened and why, in my opinion, and then set that analysis into an international perspective. The Thai politics of today are an outcome of the huge social and economic changes of the past generation. Over 30 years, average per capita income tripled, the leap from low income to mid-income status. Japan and then the East Asian NICs had made the same leap earlier, but the time span has been getting shorter, making it more difficult for the society and each individual to absorb this change. The gains were far from equally spread. As the economy boomed, inequality gaped wider, in contrast to neighboring countries where the income gap was diminishing. By the end of the boom, the distribution in assets was especially skewed, and Thailand hovered near the top of international league tables for inequality. Thailand made this leap to middle-income status in the era of globalization, neoliberal ideology, and the spread of multinational capital across the globe. This is a crude snapshot of the resulting social profile based on the distribution of the workforce in the mid-2000s. Several things to note. First, though large-scale manufacturing now provides the dynamism of the economy, supplying over 80% of exports, it employs only 8%, around 8% of the workforce. That's because multinational capital imports its current best technology rather than choosing one appropriate to the country's endowments. Second, a white-collar workforce of managers, administrators, and professionals has been rapidly developed to run this new urban economy, but it's still very small, only around 15% of the workforce. The proportion of people in agriculture has fallen. In fact, it's almost halved over a generation, but it's still relatively large, 2/5 of the total. And fourth, many people now work in a swollen informal sector, including vendors, backyard workshops, petty enterprises, but above all, casual labor in construction, service industries, and so on. Agriculture and the informal sector combined employ 2/3 of the total, and there is a large flow of migration back and forth within these two segments. I'll come back to this. For perspective, compare the same distribution in Japan in 1970 at about the same stage of development. Note that the labor force in industry is 4 times larger than in Thailand. That's a function of its industrializing with largely domestic capital and government protection. The white-collar workforce is also much larger, while agriculture and the informal sector are less than half the size in Thailand. So the time when you industrialize and develop and the international background affects what is the social shape that emerges. So that's the profile. But what has been the lived experience of this past generation of economic growth and change? I want to sketch 2 very different passages through the period, one for the peasant farmer and the other for the recruit into the new white-collar urban middle class. Thailand's countryside is dominated by smallholder family farms. 2 generations ago, most were still around the poverty line and focused on survival. They grew rice for subsistence and a surplus for cash. Their lives were largely circumscribed by the village, and their interaction with the state was rather limited. That has totally changed. Virtually all have now been incorporated into the market through cash cropping, contract farming, and so on. Because world prices for agricultural goods declined steadily across this generation, and because all investment, public and private, went into the urban economy, not agriculture, productivity has remained low, and returns from agriculture have almost stagnated. Rural families have shared in economic growth, not by growing more, but by moving more. Technology has provided greatly increased mobility through good roads, cheap motorcycles, regular tour bus services, and budget air travel. Rural families now export labor to the nearby town, to the capital of Bangkok, or farther afield. One modest village in Thailand's northeast, surveyed recently, had family members working in 16 of Thailand's provinces, plus Laos, Malaysia, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Japan, and the Netherlands. Also, with growing local income from remittances, the local economies have diversified too. The same village had people now employed as health officer, local politician, janitor, seamstress, fortune teller, butcher, street vendor, musician, contractor, and rice trader, and running businesses such as a beauty salon, barber shop, taxi service, tractor hire, rice mill, auto repair, grocery shop, and restaurant. 60% of rural incomes are now earned outside agriculture. So rural families' lives and economies are now much more complex than they were a generation ago. Families and people have more assets to protect. They have higher aspirations, especially for their children, to escape totally from agriculture through education. And they have much greater demands on government to regulate prices, to provide credit, to improve local facilities. They also have a much broader view of the world because they've been to Bangkok and beyond, because they can travel in the mind through television, which came in the 1980s, and the net, which came in the 2000s. As the current catchphrase goes, our eyes are wide open, da sawang lao. Let's now turn to the recruits into the new white-collar middle class created to run the urban economy as managers, professionals, and administrators. Most come from Chinese origins, though they have intermarried and integrated over 2 to 3 generations or more. Most come from small business families, but were launched into new career paths by better access to higher education and growing demand. Many took at least a part of their education abroad, largely from the US, but some from Eton and Oxford. In the 80s boom, when the inflood of foreign investment created a shortage of educated and experienced people, urban salary levels were boosted to near international levels, creating a very big income gap. This new white-collar middle class took shape as Bangkok was transformed into a globalized city flooded with Japanese salarymen and European tourists. They enthusiastically adopted an Asian version of the global middle-class consumption pattern: Japanese car, Hong Kong shopping trips, Korean soap operas, and Chinese food. They take pride in the emergence of China and its economic miracle. They aspire to be part of an emerging, prosperous, urban Asia. Their gaze is directed outside rather than inside the country. They are much more likely to have visited Singapore, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Boston, and LA than ever to have set foot in a Thai village. Backs turned to the countryside, face outward to the world. Last year, I gave an hour-long sketch of rural transformation, similar to just now, to 20 top executives of one of the biggest banks. And you can feel when an audience is amazed and embarrassed to learn something new, especially from a foreigner. But afterwards, one of them said, "You know, I got it," he said. "They know us, but we don't know them." How then did this social transformation impact on politics? As background, we need to bear in mind that Thailand has experienced no mass political upheaval in the past. The old feudal order was collapsed very easily. There was no mass nationalist movement against colonial rule. The communist insurgency was crushed with US money and weapons. The ruling power, as a sort of rolling oligarchy, has evolved by changing with the times, free of any serious outside threat. The feudal nobility was first transformed into a colonial-style bureaucracy, then the modern military appeared to share their power. And the appearance of a parliament offered little threat because the parliament was dominated by money. Even recently, over 2/3 of the members consist of male entrepreneurs who occupy 2.5% of the population, so everyone else is underrepresented. This parliament has operated as a business club for brokering deals, sharing out the budget, and negotiating with the bureaucracy. Pressure to change this system, pressure to change this difficulty most people have of getting access to power, has been growing across this generation of social and economic upheaval, but especially in the last 15-odd years. Initially, however, this was not pressure to overthrow this oligarchy, but just to gain better access to it, either by negotiation or by protest to demand attention. And because power and wealth has been so concentrated in the capital city, that protest evolved one very special tactic: marching on the capital. It's not new. The first protest invasions of the city took place in 1975 by northern farmers. But the modern phase dates back to 1991, when northeastern farmers started marching along the highway to Bangkok in a mass protest against foreign policy. After that, the Assembly of the Poor brought groups to camp outside Government House in 95 and 96, and in the 98 financial crisis, Bangkok was literally besieged. There were police trying to block all the highways to keep them out, by groups of rice farmers, dairy producers, cassava farmers, and everyone else protesting against low prices and expensive inputs. The city invasions that have provoked the crises over the past 2 years have a history stretching back over 30 years. But while in that phase there was a lot of protest, there was no mass interest in seeking change through the ballot box. The parliament, for most people, this parliament, this business club, seemed remote and irrelevant to their lives. They had to vote once a year, once every 3 or 4 years, at a general election, choosing among a menu of rich businessmen who did nothing much for them. But it's hardly surprising that most people took little interest and either sold their vote or bargained it for some local facility, like piped water or a paved road. Electoral politics in that era was not something that made the heart pound or the pulse race. But that situation changed spectacularly in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Because of changes in the 97 Constitution, especially decentralization to elective local government, people began to vote much, much more. Not just for an MP once every 3 or 4 years, but for a senator, their village heads, provincial councillors, district assembly, and local mayor. What's more, in these new elections, they often voted for people who they knew, and certainly they could see the results of their choices in what local government did. The education about the value and power of the vote was rapid and overwhelming. Thaksin, the mobile phone billionaire who was elected Prime Minister in 2001 and ejected by coup in 2006, brought this new enthusiasm for elections to the national level. That was not because he himself was so interested in social change or really aware of the repressed demand for access to politics. He first presented himself as a businessman who would make the economy grow faster, and he had a side interest in using political power to multiply his own wealth. He did not transform the politics, but he himself was transformed by them. Between 2001 and 2004, he shed his image as a businessman and presented himself as a type of leader often described as populist. But since populist is often deployed as a term of abuse or is the subject of confusion over definition, I need to be a bit precise about what Thaksin's populism meant. Really, 3 things. First, he made some simple redistributive reforms: universal health care, microcredit, agrarian debt relief, and farm price support. These measures had great appeal to the majority chunk of population, the farmers and informal sector workers occupying 2/3 of my pie chart. For instance, earlier health programs were either confined to those in the formal sector or offered to people who were prepared to define themselves as poor or low income, which of course is very humiliating. But his scheme was for all, as a right. This principle had enormous appeal. Even those who never used the scheme say they liked the idea of it. And the microcredit and price support schemes, however badly implemented, had a very real impact on many people's incomes and are warmly remembered today. Second, Thaksin offered himself as a leader of the people through media exposure, local tours, rhetoric, and self-image. He said, "I am your leader. You tell me what to do." Now, this stance is standard everywhere in our media-drenched age, but against the background of Thailand's crusty oligarchic politics, it seemed revolutionary. People felt empowered by him and rewarded him with rock star-like popularity. Thaksin's opponents have now copied all his populist policies, but they are unwilling or incapable of abandoning the aloof patrimonial style of the old politics so they are not rewarded with the same popularity. Third, Thaksin increasingly presented himself as an enemy of the old order, of the bureaucrats, the generals, the old business politicians, the hangers-on of the palace, and the journalists and academics who are part of that world. By doing so, he tapped reserves of deep resentment that had been hidden in Thailand's repressive political climate. This was a big shock and probably the last straw. Now let me talk about the backlash, the reaction, which has shaped the tumultuous politics of the last 7 years. The three spearheads of this reaction have been the three pillars of the old political order: the senior bureaucracy, the military, and the palace. All three have remained largely unreformed in the passage to the present day. The core of the Thai bureaucracy, the provincial administration, was created in the late 19th century on a colonial model of district commissioners. In most colonial states, this machinery was overhauled or swept away in the transition to independent democratic nation states. But in Thailand, with no nationalist upheaval, the framework remained largely unchanged. Officials still wear uniforms that separate them from ordinary mortals. They operate from grandiose buildings which symbolize the intrusion of central power into the locality, and they spend a lot of time on rituals to restate their special magic. Although their sheen has diminished somewhat in recent years, they still have the whiff of a self-conscious ruling caste. Thaksin ridiculed them and started to reform them, making them deadly enemies. The military ruled Thailand for half a century, and although its influence has been on the wane recently, those 50 years left a huge internal legacy, particularly the military's belief in its right to intervene in politics at will. Even after the military had been dislodged from overarching power in the 90s, it resisted demands for internal reform, retaining an undue grip on broadcast media, blocking demands for greater transparency on its budget, resisting political control, and ignoring calls for downsizing, especially of the bloated senior officer corps, still 1,600 generals, more than in the US. Thaksin did not threaten the military with reform, but he tried clumsily to manipulate their internal politics to gain control, and that threatened the old guard, another enemy. The palace is more difficult because its internal workings are a black box. But the institution has grown stronger as the reign acquired the dignity of age, and of course, reform is beyond debate. Moreover, the monarchy is a source of great symbolic power that can be deployed in political competition. Members of the palace entourage complained that Thaksin's personal popularity was intruding on emotional space reserved for the king. And opponents of Thaksin rallied support by claiming that they were acting in defense of the monarchy, even though there didn't seem to be any reason that that defense was needed. And of course, the proponents of the coup in 2006 used the king's birth colour of yellow as their insignia. The reaction of these three institutions is not so surprising. They are the pillars of the old oligarchic order that this upsurge from below threatened to change. More tantalizing is the support for this conservative reaction from the urban middle class, especially the Bangkok portion. The Bangkok press, responsive to this middle-class audience, came out in support of the coup, and obviously middle-class participants flocked to the anti-Thaksin demos. And also, the term middle class became part of the rhetoric of the discourse. Sonti Limthongkul, spearhead of the anti-Thaksin protest movement, claimed that Thaksin's unholy alliance of big business and popular support was a threat to the interests, particularly of the middle class. And he specifically tried to organize and rally the middle class as a political force. Now, in similar axial points in the history of other countries, when new forces emerged from below to oppose an old oligarchic order, the middle class has often identified its interests with the new forces, but in this case, they didn't. I wonder why. First, I think insecurity. As Sonti's rhetoric emphasized, and as my pie chart showed, the middle class is very small. If the mass starts to pursue its own interests through the ballot box, the middle class will be swamped. It's conscious also that its income level, bestowed by globalization, is anomalous and vulnerable. In addition, it's important to remember that up to the early 1980s, the Thai Chinese felt some degree of discrimination in Thailand. That's no longer the case, but Sonti cleverly played upon the memory, presenting himself as the good, loyal, unthreatening Chinese, the Lukjin Rak Cha. The second reason, I think, why the middle class has played this role is the enormous social and cultural gap that separates this outward-gazing middle class from the rural hinterland. They don't understand rural society because they're not interested in it, and they fear it because they don't understand it. Any rational skepticism about Thailand's populism was multiplied many times by a lurking fear of the mass. One prominent politician, in fact one of the top ministers of the recent government, openly referred to Thaksin's supporters as the great unwashed. It's a phrase that speaks volumes about attitudes. The coup of 2006 set this alliance of the three old institutions and the middle class on a slippery slope down from removing Thaksin to questioning democracy. Plan A seemed simple: remove Thaksin by coup and conviction for corruption, destroy his system by dissolving the party and banning politicians, and root out support in the rural area by intimidation campaigns used against communism in the 1980s. But it didn't work, because what was happening was not about one man, but a major change in the political culture. So, Plan B: re-engineer the political system through a new constitution, shifting power from parliament to bureaucracy, and reinstall the military as a state within the state. But then an election was held in 2007, and the Thaksinite party won, despite massive intervention by the military, using public resources and public money to try and contrive an election result. So the backlash now turned on parliamentary democracy itself. Academics and bureaucrats wrote books advocating greater powers for the military and monarchy. The yellow-clad protesters floated the idea of doing away with one person, one vote altogether. And an idea of Thai-style democracy, which means no democracy at all, made a reappearance. Perhaps most worryingly and most significantly, businessmen, top businessmen in Thailand, have begun to talk longingly about a China model, meaning an authoritarian regime with liberal economic policies that brings about rapid economic growth. In street battles, red shirts claiming to be defending democracy clashed with yellow shirts claiming to be defending the monarchy, a moment of really terrible clarity in Thailand's modern political history. The division is more complex than the simple red-yellow color coding suggests. It's not class warfare in the old sense. It's not the poor versus the rich. As I stressed earlier, the motives for the movement have come from growing prosperity over the past generation. Many red supporters, like Thaksin, are businessmen who have done very, very well indeed. But the red movement's center of gravity is in the rural society transformed. The protest is fundamentally against the great inequalities of wealth and power, not just because those inequalities have got worse over the past generation, but because they have become more obvious in a society of such flowing movement. The protest is primarily political, against the oligarchy, whose domination is seen to stand behind these inequalities. That's evident in the movement's two most popular pieces of rhetoric: railing against double standards, meaning the different treatment accorded to those with celestial connections and those without, and calling themselves Prai and their enemies Amat, words for serf and noble from the feudal order, thereby mocking the backwardness of the whole political system. But what is interesting is this: this movement's key strategy is to use the ballot box. At the 2 rounds of protest in Bangkok in 2009 and 2010, the single protest demand was to hold an election because the results of the past 3 had been set aside. This is very, very different from the West, where electoral politics are beset by disillusion. Now, that's Thailand. In the last few minutes, I want to suggest some broader parallels. There's nothing special about what I've been describing, nothing special about what is happening in Thailand. Most societies have gone through something similar, often many times. But there are some special aspects which are part of the present-day world and relevant elsewhere in this time. One of the biggest changes worldwide of the last few decades has been change in the nature and status of work. This has partly come about because of technologies of automation and partly because of the neoliberal attack on labour organisation. As in my Thai pie chart, fewer and fewer people everywhere are engaged in the jobs that power economic growth, and more are consigned to informal sectors and urban underclasses. Thailand has a very fertile agricultural sector that retains people much better than in most countries. In the troubles that have spread across the Middle East like a forest fire, the disaffected urbanites have been at the core of the protest. This decline of secure work underlies a worldwide trend of growing inequality. Capital's share of GDP is increasing, while labour's share is dropping. That trend has run in the OECD since 1980 for 2 decades, and in the US since 1973, 3 decades, US since 1973 for almost 4 decades. And income inequality often underlies other kinds of division, particularly cultural division, cultural difference, and political exclusion. Growing inequality also results in rising calls for redistribution, but neoliberalism has also mounted an attack on public goods of all kinds, especially welfare services. Conservatives now dream that inequality can be overcome through social mechanisms, such as the Great Society idea in the UK and the sufficiency economy here. But nowhere has this been proved to work. There needs to be a state role somehow. Declining security of work also fuels a growing trend of migration, both within borders and across them. Political conflict is now adding to these flows, and very soon environmental insecurity will too. Migration is not only movement, it's a form of education. Movers tend to be shakers too. Often it is political leaders or movements labelled as populist who generate programs that appeal to the insecure, the aggrieved, and the displaced. These range from accidental populists like Thaksin to the web populists appearing around the Middle East. It's relatively easy for such figures to offer some simple measures for temporary relief and some sense of empowerment. It's much harder to restructure society and economy for longer-term balance. That tends to make populist regimes unstable and vulnerable. If you like, they lack an ism, a theory offering a more long-term and far-reaching response. The countries where the regime is resisting the wave of protest are generally those where these 2 institutions remain strong. Moreover, close at hand, the China model offers an ism which is very attractive to pro-authoritarians. The new wave theorizing over democracy placed great emphasis on the role of the urban middle class as a pro-democratic force. But Thailand and many other countries have offered a corrective view. The urban middle class's enthusiasm for democracy is predicated on an expectation that it will have direct benefits and an influential role. And perhaps that theorizing assumed a sociology which is no longer found in middle-income countries in the post-globalization era. Democracy is under threat, not from disillusion and disinterest on the part of the mass, but from opposition by old institutions and insecure middle classes. Street mobs and populists are thrown up by mass frustration, but offer no long-term solutions. There are ideas in the air about rebalancing economic strategies, about targeting inequality, and about thickening democratic processes, but these are not yet an ism which has the power to succeed. Thank you.